Our overarching takeaways on the disinformation front over the past 3 or 4 days have been the sort of democratization of disinformation on a lot of social media platforms. So I'm sure most people have seen among their friends and family, even let alone political pundits, some form of conspiracy theory around whether Trump does indeed have COVID-19, who gave it to him, how that happened, whether it was an intentional effort. There's a huge amount of conspiratorial content circulating on platforms like Facebook at the moment. Definitely a dry run for the kind of very speedy and widespread disinformation and conspiracy theories that we could see around election day itself and around the results in the days afterwards. I think it's a critical warning for what we might be having to prepare ourselves for on November the 3rd and afterwards. The infrastructure doesn't exist to deal with this problem effectively within the platform, and so we're going to have to rely on users, journalists, researchers to be trying to handle this themselves at pace and scale that they're also not, equipped to handle. So it sets a pretty worrying precedent ahead of November 3rd for the kinds of democratized disinformation that we might see around the vote.
Hi, I'm Carole Swisher, the host of the New York Times new podcast, Sway, and I'm here because I'm shocked to say Mark Zuckerberg didn't invite me to be a member of his new Supreme Court, the so-called Independent Oversight Board. But anyway, that board is still not functional. The election is only 5 weeks away, and every day there's another story about something terrible happening on Facebook. So that's why the experts are gathered here today for the real Facebook Oversight Board. This is a group of leading academics, civil rights leaders, and ex-Facebook employees who say that we need an emergency intervention. This is pretty strong language, so today the plan is to outline why. So let me introduce the first guests. We have Larry Tribe, who doesn't need a lot of introduction. He's one of the leading scholars of constitutional law in this country, the Carl M. Loeb Professor at Harvard Law School. Shoshana Zuboff, who is a professor emerita at Harvard Business School, and she is also the author of a book called Surveillance Capitalism. And Jessica Gonzalez, the co-CEO of Free Press, which is one of the members of the hashtag Stop Hate for Profit Coalition. That's the group that's been targeting Facebook's advertisers and asking for them to take action until it cleans up its act. They're going to wait a long time. Okay, Larry, the American Constitution is your area of expertise. You've been studying this for a very long time. Where are we on the threat scale now? And how do you see the risks ahead?
I think that we are at 1 minute to midnight on what used to be the atomic bomb scale, the threat scale. We have clearly a leader who is dictatorial in impulse. He says that he has no interest in counting the ballots because they're all fake. We're ready to have a complete devolution of our representative system of government, self-government. When you add to that fire the fuel of the hatred that can be spawned, spread, and made viral by Facebook and other social media, and the disinformation, and the micro-targeting that can enable people to use that disinformation to distort the outcome of the election. What you have really is a destruction of the ordinary system in which people who are dissatisfied with the way the government is running things, with the treatment of the coronavirus, with the government's decision essentially to argue for the destruction of the Affordable Care Act, where all of that dissatisfaction, instead of being channeled in the ordinary way into the replacement of this regime with a government that is at least somewhat responsive to people's needs, all of that dissatisfaction and anger is channeled toward chaos, channeled toward violence, which is then exploited by the government to say, we need a strong man, we need to control that violence. It's a vicious cycle. And when that cycle is a cyclone, and when an entity as powerful as Facebook, more powerful in many ways than any single government in the world, simply smiles and says, oh yes, we're trying, but isn't transparent, isn't responding, we are at DEFCON 5. It's a real crisis. And I don't tend to,
that's what I'm saying. Would you
easily.
put any other part in history where we're this close to that, or is it just this particular weaponized media company?
I suppose before the Civil War, we were close to falling apart completely, but certainly not since the 1860s have we been in a situation where it is so hard to hold the system together. You know, you think about the Second Coming, that great poem in which the center will not hold. We are right there. And any claim that criticizing Facebook for not exercising some degree of discipline and responsibility and self-control is somehow a violation of free speech is a complete inversion. There's nothing about what we're talking about that involves the government censoring Facebook. It's a matter of Facebook doing what it knows how to do. It's taken down ISIS ads, it's taken down child pornography. It could take down a lot of this stuff that stirs hate and misleads people, tells them the election is over before it's even begun.
Yes, Professor Tribe, he should have finished Harvard, in my opinion, to understand it better and taken a course from you on that issue. Shoshana, you've been trying to sound the warning bell about this technology, especially around the business models of these companies. And here we are. Where are you on the doomsday scale that Professor Tribe was talking about?
Facebook has known about these risks and these dynamics for many years, predating 2016, because we have a slew of countries around the world that have already suffered this cyclone, and Facebook did nothing about it. In 2016, eventually they pledged, you know, this would not stand again, and yet here we are facing the same cyclone. So this is intolerable. The question is, how did we get here? So Mr. Zuckerberg made the devil's pact with Mr. Trump. He accommodated to Mr. Trump's hate speech, incitements to violence, and just raw, straight up lies. By doing that, he opened the floodgates for the Bolsonaros, Brazil, and similar kinds of dictators and wannabe authoritarians all around the world. It is this devil's pact, this Faustian deal with Trump, that also had a nice umbrella effect. All the spidery minions who revolve around Trump and that administration, they're also getting a free pass. And all the people inciting violence in Kenosha and all of these alignments, they're also getting a free pass. This is where the final decision not to hold political advertising subject to the same standards of truth as all other material on that platform, this is where it comes from.
All right.
And this is why we have to be on high alert, because this pact is still in existence. It's still holding strong.
Jessica, do you think it could all happen here, that Facebook could be used to incite violence on the streets of America as it has elsewhere?
Of course, it's already happened here. You know, when I met with Mark Zuckerberg in July in response to the Stop Hate for Profit campaign, I laid out for him that not only did the UN find that Facebook was played a contributing role in the violence and the genocide in Myanmar, but that Facebook is already being used to facilitate and normalize mass atrocities here in the US. We have an atrocity happening at the US-Mexico border, where our families and our loved ones and immigrant folks are being locked in cages. Children are being separated from their parents. That itself is a violent act happening right here on US soil. Of course, the events in Kenosha are very notable, but not at all an anomaly. Muslim advocates put out an excellent timeline on their website about how they've been lifting up the concern about violence and armed protests being hosted and organized on Facebook event pages. They've been raising this with Facebook for the past 5 years and have not seen the kind of action that's commensurate with the level of threat that the communities are facing, right? And so this is not a new situation for Facebook. They actually have a policy that supposedly prohibits organizing armed protests outside of mosques and other religious places. They're failing to enforce that policy. The consequences are deadly.
One final question to each of you now. Professor Tribe, I'm going to ask you a sort of a three-part one, if you could keep it relatively tight. One, are our laws built to withstand this? Two, is the Republic at risk? You were saying 1 minute to midnight, which is using a nuclear term. And if you had one message for Mark Zuckerberg to take away today, what is it? What would be one message? And then Shoshana and then Jessica can finish up.
I think our laws were designed long ago and they were not made to sustain quite this kind of attack. And my one message to Mark Zuckerberg is it really worth giving up all that we have, all that this country has made possible, selling your soul just to make your company the biggest on the planet? Is that really worth it? And I hope he recognizes that it isn't, and in the long run that he will be sucked up in the whirlwind too.
Shoshana?
I was interested in Jessica's remarks a minute ago about the kind of things we need them to do. But, if we get into the kind of scenario, and of course, I hope and pray that we do not, but Professor Tribe a little bit ago talked about, the idea of a coup and how we mobilize ourselves around that. The key thing that Mr. Zuckerberg needs to do if our republic comes under that kind of threat is he needs to pull the plug. He needs to self-sabotage. He needs to shut it down so that it cannot be deployed by the forces that would undermine our democracy in a way that it will take generations for us to recover from.
All right, Jessica, last word, very quickly.
Look, I won't get to solutions, but I'll just have a moral call here. How much richer does Mark Zuckerberg need to be? Look, he has a chance to move to the right side of history. There are millions of people who are suffering and feeling a lot of pain right now. He has a role in that, but it's not too late to shift course. What side of history does he stand on?
I think we'll end on that. Be better, Mark. Words, be better.
I'm Carole Cadwalladr, and I'm a journalist with The Guardian and The Observer and the non-profit The Citizens, which is helping to organise the real Oversight Board. And I've leapt in to cover for Cara Swisher, who unfortunately can't host this segment. But I just want to welcome, we've got three more amazing guests. Derek Johnson, who is the president of the NAACP, which is one of the leading civil rights groups in America, and is a member of the Stop Hate for Profit coalition. And we have Maria Ressa, who's she's one of the most prominent journalists in the Philippines, currently facing 6 years in prison after being found guilty of cyber libel. And Shireen Mitchell, who's the founder of Digital Sisters and is an expert in digital voter suppression. So thanks so much all for being here. Maria, I want to go to you next, because when it comes to the worst case scenario of what can happen in terms of Facebook's impact on an election, I mean, you are living that worst case scenario, aren't you? In the Philippines, in 2016, so the same year that Trump came to power, Duterte was elected a dictator, an authoritarian. And that was with the help of Facebook, wasn't it?
Yes. So he was one of 5 candidates. He was elected. I would say his election in May was followed a month later by Brexit. That was the beginning of the dominoes that began to fall, right? But our dystopian present is your future. This idea of inciting hate, of inciting violence, of bringing out the worst of people. This is systematic. And the last thing I'd say is just look at what's happened in the United States from 2016 to 2020, when both sides of Black Lives Matter was targeted. It changes the way people think. It's not just emotional. Emotional is in the moment. But what the goal of influence operations is to change the way you think, which will change the way you act.
Thanks, Maria. Shireen, I want to come to you because you are an expert in digital voter suppression. Now, a lot of people won't know what that means. Can you explain what that is and how it works for us?
Yeah, so thank you for having me, of course, here to talk about these aspects and the impact of it. I think that the reason why people have such a hard time with the term digital voter suppression is because it seems like something that's abstract, right? It seems like it's something more virtual than realistic. We're used to having the conversation about voter suppression that we all know, which is right, polling places being moved, the intimidation factor, which is real on the ground, like with this violence, for example, in Fairfax County, after those who went out to vote on the first day of elections, we saw an organization of other supporters who showed up to counter them and try to stop them from voting. Like, we've seen the physical versions of this. What we haven't done or dealt with is the digital versions of this. And so we've just defined this in our second report to get people to understand what digital voter suppression is. And it's basically using any form of social media, networking, images, ads, anything to sort of tell people something different in terms of how they can or cannot vote. But the reason that we talk about digital voter suppression is not just what Maria said about the influence network. It's what people eventually believe, no matter what happens. So in 2016, and a great example of the Russian IRA sort of fake accounts and pushing narratives, basically also targeting black voters specifically. So I use the example of Michigan, where, for example, 90K people made it through the polls, made it through the barriers that they are dealing with on the ground just to go vote, and they decided not to vote top of the ticket. They voted down ballot. Be clear that those who didn't vote top of the ticket, he won that one state by 11K, but 70K people in Detroit alone, a majority Black city in Michigan, didn't vote top of the ticket either. And so when I say impact and targeting Black voters, this is what I mean. And I completely agree about the potential of violence that will also happen when we have this gap of ballots coming in late, or anything that's happening with vote by mail that has also been targeted, and communities that have been targeted based on that.
Thanks, Shireen. That was very detailed, very extensive. Thank you. Derek, I want to turn back to you because the history of voter suppression Black voter suppression in America is very ugly, isn't it? And this idea that it's now possible to do this at scale across the country, beaming this sort of toxic material onto people's phones, into their feeds, onto their laptops. What's your view on that? Some people say that, you know, this is the machinery of modern day fascism. Do you go as far as that, or what's your view?
The level of micro targeting based on this social platform is unbelievable. This is a decade yet century-old problem in the United States. I've convened a leadership group, and they meet once a month over 9 months. And the first book that we have them engage in is called Redemption. And in that book, it talks about all of the efforts in 1875 and 1876 to suppress the Black vote through communications, information, making allegations that are false, creating statements of corruption. All of that is very similar to what's taking place now. inclusive of the level of violence that we've seen in 1875 and 1876. And if you can draw that out into the 1920s, the 1930s, when we see an upsurge in racial hatred and what I call tribalism, 1950s, 60s, and now this platform puts all of the tactics and the fear mongering that was used in the past on steroids, where we can micro-target, you could create enough fervor of hatred around false allegation and misinformation to truly cause harm to individuals and absolutely subvert democracy by suppressing the Black vote.
I mean, it seems astonishing, doesn't it, that we're talking about that in this day and age. But Maria, to go back to you again, you talk about victims of harm. You are a victim of Facebook harm, aren't you? I mean, can you explain what this means to you personally, how it's impacted your life?
Again, I go back to influence operations, and 2016, it was Black Lives Matter. You talked about that, but in the Philippines, it was journalist equals criminal, and I was a target of that in 2016, right? I laughed about it, but by 2017, President Duterte said the exact same thing. So it's bottom up, top down, same thing happening to you guys. And then after that, a week after President Duterte attacked us, the weaponization of the law, I got my first subpoena, 11 cases in 2018. In 2019, I had 8 arrest warrants. I had to post bail 8 times to stay free. In 2020, I got convicted. So what is the reality? Am I a criminal or a journalist? Well, I'm a journalist. Nothing has changed, but perception has changed. Context has changed. And I guess the main thing that I want to point out here, which we haven't mentioned, is that in the end, these platforms, lies laced with anger and hate, spread further and faster. So to do really well on the platform, you must use these emotions, you must incite it. And if you don't, the recommendation engine, much like other social media platforms, will push you further towards extremism, right? So I think that's one, is it's biased against facts, biased against journalists who are trying to tell you the facts. And now imagine when it hits a fracture line of society, Black Lives Matter. And what happens after 4 years? You can see what happened after 4 years. And it's going to get worse if nothing is done about it. In terms of voter suppression, it's only one of the many manipulations you can do. Facebook has become a behavior modification system. And that needs to stop, because how can we have democracy if we don't have not just facts, but do we have free will? Do we have agency to choose?
So I just want to come back to you, Derek, because, I mean, the latest report on the suppression of Black voters using Facebook not only refused to give any detailed comment about what happened, it also refused to reveal these ads. So tell me, what do you make of the response from Facebook to this? And I want to go further and say, is it actually possible? Do you think that America is a democracy if this can happen, if Black voters can be targeted in this way?
The question of whether or not this country is a democracy, I think is a standalone question from the fact that democracy can be subverted. And that's, I think, is key here. And what we have seen, not only in the US, and in the Brexit election, that democracy is being subverted by a platform that refused to self-regulate. And because countries do not have regulatory schemes in place, it is operating as if it's a sovereign nation within sovereign nations. That's dangerous. We are looking at a platform that should understand the power and the history of different mediums being used to deliver messaging that could cause harm to people and subvert governmental systems such as a democratically elected government. That is fearful. The most disheartening part of all of this there are nothing to hold this platform accountable. You have one individual who owns upwards of 60% of all the shares in the company, albeit publicly traded. He owns the lion's share of the shares. The board of directors cannot hold him accountable. The shareholders cannot hold him accountable. The ad buyers that use the platform, when we launched Stop Hate for a Profit campaign, we had some of the major brands around the globe to sign on and stop ad buying for the month of July, only to find out that it makes up less than 10% of the total revenue that's on the platform. So the accountability question is really serious. The fact that it's being used to subvert democracy is a problematic, but most importantly, understanding history. The use of mediums like this platform has caused harm among many individuals, genocide, and world war. We gotta be cognizant of that fact. And this platform must be made to account for future actions as we address past harm.
Coordinated inauthentic behavior sounds, innocent, and that it's over the minute you take it down. But those people live on, and they have been changed, and their actions will change society.
I absolutely agree with that.
Thanks, Maria.
Honestly, they have to be more accountable for those political ads. And I don't mean that from just political campaigns. They're punishing people who are basically trying to get out the vote as if they are the same as the politicians who are putting out this information. And that also has to change. This is not really an equal argument. So when those who are trying to get out the vote, get communities out to vote, should not be punished in the same way and classified as political ads in the same way that politicians are putting out political ads.
Okay, thanks, Shireen. So that's very clear. Get out the vote, separated from political ads, and fact checking of political ads. You believe that's vital, do you?
Yeah. Yes, absolutely.
And Maria, you've got a demand. What's your demand?
Simple, really, really simple, because there are 10 million things we can ask Facebook for. But the very, very first step for anything is take responsibility. You cannot solve a problem if you do not define it.
All right, everybody, welcome back. So for the final section, we've got another presentation from Joan Donovan, who is the research director of the Shorenstein Center at Harvard. Joan is going to walk us through something of a doomsday scenario, what could happen. Joan, do your worst.
Hello, everybody. My name is Joan Donovan. I'm the research director at Harvard Kennedy School's Shorenstein Center. Today, I'm going to talk to you about doomscaping, or what do we think about when we think about possibilities for media manipulation and disinformation in the US election cycle. So I'm going to run you through 3 very quick scenarios that we think are entirely plausible given the shape of social media and our current media environment. So scenario 1, pretty simple. It's a few weeks ahead of the election. So we are November 3rd is the last day you can vote. And on October 16th, mail-in voting continues to be attacked and discredited. And we do know that this is an ongoing theme amongst the mainstream media, and lots of confusion within different cities about what is the status of mail-in voting. But what happens when a post like this starts to go viral, claiming that Antifa is burning the votes of real Americans? It's the only chance Dems have of winning the election. Keep America great. When coupled with an image like this, which looks as if it's evidence of burning ballots, it is very difficult to stop rumors from like this from spreading, pardon the pun, like digital wildfire. And as a result, we need to know what the plan is for Facebook and social media to stop these things from happening. Very recently, there were suspicious rumors planted online that Antifa had been setting wildfires in the Pacific Northwest. This was not true, but it expended a ton of the resources of different agencies and journalists to debunk a claim. In scenario 2, we end up with a few days outside of the last day you can vote on November 3rd. And the situation is that people are getting to their polling stations and their personal information doesn't match up. People's zip codes are muddled and don't match their IDs. People are getting angry and polling booth staff are getting anxious. And then compounding this already existing problem is a rumor. It starts to spread on WhatsApp. Someone messages, hey, I'm telling you this because I love you guys. The polling stations have been closed. It's crazy down here. People are banging on the doors and fighting. I just don't want any of you to get hurt. Stay safe. A message like this is going to be very difficult to source, especially if it starts to get forwarded through different WhatsApp groups. And depending upon the community that it's targeting, it may have downstream effects where people are afraid to go to the polls. And we do know that disinformation is targeting disproportionately Black communities, Latinx communities. And so when we start to see disinformation like this, very similar to what happened at the beginning of the pandemic around martial law, we start to worry about what kind of misinformation cascade is going to form around it. And then in scenario 3, another thing that we think is entirely plausible based on very recent events is that it is election day and people are going out to the polls or they're postmarking their envelopes and getting their ballot in the mail. But paid ads start declaring victories before anyone has conceded. Soon the claim goes viral. The situation is completely confusing. People take to the streets and start protesting. So we do know that people, the public does get, angry and upset, and also wants to push for accountability. And so in moments like this, this can be amplified, or this kind of outrage can be amplified if different groups online start to use the already available tools of digital advertising to claim, that their guy wins. And so these are a set of scenarios that we are very much aware are possible, given the structure of social media in this current moment and the affordances that it provides to media manipulators and disinformers. And the last thing I'll say is essentially that we're entering a period of what researchers are thinking about as the Olympics of disinformation. It's not the Super Bowl, it's not a discrete event, but we are going to see a rolling cascade of different kinds of media manipulation attempts. And that is something that we are very, very worried about, especially as social media companies have been largely overseeing themselves and their own policies. So we do need increased transparency and an auditing process. Thank you very much.
All right, thank you, Joan. So doomscaping, it sounds like landscaping, but with dead flowers. And then misinformation cascade, another nice word that sounds just like awful now that you've said it. But let me introduce the other guests. We have Jonathan Greenblatt, president of the Anti-Defamation League. He's part of the hashtag Stop Hate for Profit coalition of civil rights groups who've been targeting Facebook's advertisers to persuade them to pull their advertising until Facebook cleans up its act. That could take a while. Yael Eisenstat, an ex-CIA officer who was Facebook's head of elections integrity for political ads and was a national security advisor to Vice President Biden. And Farhana Kara, the executive director of Muslim Advocates and previously the counsel to the Senate Judiciary Committee. So let's start talking about this. Jonathan, we'll start with you. Jonathan, traditionally, most people don't do well under dictators. So what is your doomsday scenario and how worried are you?
Well, thank you for the question, Kara. And I think it's an understatement to say that most people don't do well under dictators.
Yeah.
We've watched the rise of authoritarianism with great concern year over year. It's gotten worse and worse. And now as we look forward to this election, we're deeply alarmed at ADL about the possibility of violence in the streets. We have been focused on militia activity for years because armed militia groups, typically far-right extremists, have employed anti-Semitic, racist, Islamophobic rhetoric for years. What's different today, Kara, is we have them literally marching in the streets and a president in the Oval Office encouraging this activity rather than tamping it down.
Mhm.
So what I'm worried about is something we've already seen this summer. After the death of George Floyd, far-right militia groups organized out in the open on Facebook groups. And when we brought this information to Facebook to ask them to take it down, they demurred, they stalled, they refused, and ultimately several people were killed in Kenosha, Wisconsin.
Yeah.
Look, the stakes
done it
couldn't be
before,
higher,
Annette.
and it's scary.
Just they've done this before internationally. So, you know, this is, you've already seen manifestation of this. How, so you think it'll just get worse, or that it becomes even more?
We would predict it will get worse based on the fact that only afterwards, after we pointed it out and the evidence was incontrovertible, did Facebook move to take down those groups, even though they were clearly not only violating societal norms, Kara, they were violating Facebook's own terms of service, but they wouldn't act. But we've seen just this past weekend with Proud Boy rallies on the East Coast and the West Coast. Our militia groups right now are testing the waters. They are pushing the boundaries. They are mobilizing and preparing. So we've never been, in 100+ years, we've never been alarmed quite like this.
All right, so let's go to Yael. You've seen this presentation, you hear what Jonathan's saying. How plausible is this?
So Joan basically just highlighted every one of my nightmares right now. The closer we get to election day, well, sorry, as Joan says, we're already in election day, but the closer we get to the last election day and then moving forward, I suspect we're going to start seeing videos of, look at this postal worker throwing ballots in the river, or just all sorts of things that we cannot confirm if these videos are true or not. And they will go viral because Facebook in particular continues to refuse to fact check politicians. So the number one scenario terrifies me because he's already spent so much time, the current president, making sure that his supporters don't trust this process. And then when he says, see, I'm proving it, that could really cause some chaos. And then just quickly to scenario 4 about after November 3rd, that's the period I am most concerned about. We're already, the tensions are high, emotions are high. All of this has been set up. And then if after November 3rd, these social media platforms allow content to go out, either claiming victory prematurely, rallying supporters to get angry and get out into the streets, that's where we have a real tinderbox that could explode. And I do think they can do something about it. They do, I mean, I can say for Facebook, having spent a bit of time there, they do have the technical capability to, at the very least, say we're not going to take any ads that claim victory or that talk about results at all until it's official, because that's paid speech. So that's not a free speech issue. And then on the organic content side, they can, at the very, very minimum, every post that talks about results gets an automatic flag. I'm not saying censor it. I'm not saying take it down. But instead of saying click through to go to our voting information center, you pop something up that says this is premature. The results are not in. I don't think Twitter or Facebook at this point are going to be able to stop some of the things we're all scared about because they've allowed it to get to this point. But they could still take bolder steps. And I'll just say one more thing, since I know time is short. They'll say, but that's not scalable to the entire world. That's what they said when I try to put forward voter suppression plans. That is correct. We are in a crisis here right now, and it is your job to protect this election right now and not to say, but that's not scalable to every election in the world. You chose to dominate all of the world's different platforms. You need to take this seriously.
Got it. All right, Farhana, this sort of discrimination is disproportionately directed at minorities. Can you explain some of the sort of stuff you've seen on Facebook and the impact it's had? I think everyone has seen it all over all of social media, not just Facebook, but talk about this in a little more detail.
Yeah, I think the experience of the Muslim community and other vulnerable communities has been over multiple years now. As the use of the platform has exploded, hate groups and individuals with malicious intent have been abusing the platform to promote false, misleading, inflammatory messages about Muslims, about immigrants, and it has real life consequences. So this is not a theoretical issue for the Muslim community and other vulnerable communities, but we have seen very vicious hate crimes. There are situations where hate actors have actually used Facebook to promote their acts of mass violence. The shooter at Christchurch, New Zealand is just one example. And not only that, I want to add to Joan's presentation that these worst case scenarios aren't theoretical. some of it is already happening today. Today, right now, as we're all meeting, the Trump campaign is running ads on Facebook that are purporting to say that if Joe Biden is elected, there's going to be a surge of Muslim immigrants at the border. And it's a totally false, inflammatory message, and it's being widely shared and promoted on Facebook. So,
physical borders.
Yeah.
Are there Muslim immigrants at our physical borders?
So under the Trump administration, there's certainly been a reduction in Muslim immigrants. But yeah, the implication from the Trump campaign is that there's all these Muslims, and I think the implication is at the southern border, who, if Biden was elected, there'd be suddenly thousands, tens of thousands entering the country. And it's just absolutely false. It's inflammatory. It's intended to stoke division, to stoke hate. And our community has been targeted for hate crimes by these individuals who actually sometimes even yell Trump's name as they're engaging in hate crimes targeting my community.
All right. So, Joan, Nick Clegg has been out in the papers. He's their policy head. Talking about everything they're doing to protect the election. And apparently they've been threat modeling, like you were modeling, different scenarios. Should that be public? Have you gotten access to that? And shouldn't we be able to see these?
So no, I don't have any privileged access, and I'm proud to say that my research team has not taken any funding from platform companies because we do really want to be truly understood as independent. But yeah, it's a typical way of approaching a technology problem is to try to map the entire panoply of use cases from the most, sunny and bright and useful, goodwill, all the way down to what happens when somebody live streams a hate crime, and which we've seen at the border. We've seen vigilantes arresting people and raising money on Facebook Facebook Live. And so we see these things happen over and over and over again, and you no longer need to produce a scenario that is what happens if, because you have so many case studies of what has already happened.
Should we see what they think the threat is? I mean, what are they looking at?
I think, we can look to their press releases of the things they celebrate as wins, right? The takedown of 12 or 14 pages related to peace data that was trying to, instead of engineer bot networks and other more automated forms of misinformation, they were paying freelance reporters to produce it. And those ties around coordinated, quote unquote, inauthentic behavior is the framework by which Facebook assesses threat. And so it was interesting to see them take some action on QAnon, but again, we don't have the other piece that we need, which is the transparency around what those takedowns mean and how many pages and which ones, and what is the database that we have of data that we can analyze to see where it shows up in other places. Yeah. Similar to the way that Twitter has approached transparency around their coordinated takedowns. But I think by and large, yeah, we're in a situation where we don't have the transparency to even audit the things that they claim that they're doing. And so we don't know the scale at all.
Yael, Jonathan, last word, but what are they doing in there?
Well, I must say, Joan is exactly right.
Yael, what are they doing inside there? And then I'll ask Jonathan the last question.
So, I suspect that they are going through some of the scenarios like the type that Joan highlighted in the beginning. But I've participated in some of those when I was there, and I'll just say this, all of the solutions that they will come up with will so far have been Band-Aid solutions sort of around the margins, because they're not willing to actually change how they're recommending content. They're not willing to fact check politicians. All of the critics, Jonathan's work and Farhana's, everybody's work is telling them that these are the dangerous decisions you've made. They will make some decisions around the margins, but they're not gonna, I just don't believe they're gonna make the most important decisions in time for this election. But yes, they go through all these scenarios, and then they kind of pick some Band-Aid solutions of how can we fix this that is scalable, that doesn't actually threaten our business model. They don't say those things out loud, but that was my impression when I was there of sort of what they will and will not do.
Right. Okay, Jonathan, last word. you know, you tried this, the advertiser thing, the celebrity thing. These are probably too short, and it's not, as presumably, it's not kicking them hard enough to do anything. So is it too late? Is there any action, Jonathan, and to wrap it up, that they should be taking right now?
Well, that Facebook should be taking right now?
Facebook or any of the social medias?
Look, Facebook is one of the most innovative companies in the world. It's the most sophisticated advertising platform in the history of capitalism. They could stop this tomorrow if they wanted to. Boom, no more political ads. Boom, no more posts by politicians. They could do it literally like that. They could change the algorithm, Kara, like that, if they wanted to. Unfortunately, as Yael just said, Band-Aid steps, half measures, belatedly, begrudgingly. The sad thing is, if we don't act now, again, I think the election's at risk. And I think democratic society as we know it is literally at risk. The stakes couldn't be higher.
Right. You are Mark Zuckerberg right now. I snap my fingers, you're Mark Zuckerberg. What do you do? What is the one thing you do?
I would take down all election related content, and I would turn off Facebook groups like that. That's what I would do.
Okay, thank you very much. I really appreciate these. I doubt Mark Zuckerberg is listening to you, but I really appreciate the thoughtfulness of all of you.
Our overarching takeaways on the disinformation front over the past 3 or 4 days have been the sort of democratization of disinformation on a lot of social media platforms. So I'm sure most people have seen among their friends and family, even let alone political pundits, some form of conspiracy theory around whether Trump does indeed have COVID-19, who gave it to him, how that happened, whether it was an intentional effort. There's a huge amount of conspiratorial content circulating on platforms like Facebook at the moment. Definitely a dry run for the kind of very speedy and widespread disinformation and conspiracy theories that we could see around election day itself and around the results in the days afterwards. I think it's a critical warning for what we might be having to prepare ourselves for on November the 3rd and afterwards. The infrastructure doesn't exist to deal with this problem effectively within the platform, and so we're going to have to rely on users, journalists, researchers to be trying to handle this themselves at pace and scale that they're also not, equipped to handle. So it sets a pretty worrying precedent ahead of November 3rd for the kinds of democratized disinformation that we might see around the vote.